Hello, everybody. This is Sharif Madavi with another episode of PX Talk. And today with me again, returning, is Joe Bartel. Joe Bartel runs Campion Partners. And what they do is they help doctors get more value for their services. He has a consulting practice. He's also an attorney by training. So Joe, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Sharif. Thank you for having me back.
Well, it's great. And I feel like you and I are kindred spirits when it comes to this area of value. And most of my career has been dedicated to helping doctors get more value for the services they perform. Sometimes that means raising their fees. But more fundamentally than that, Joe, what I want to ask you about today is just how do doctors go about establishing value for what they do? How should they be thinking about it? What are the different elements that kind of factor in the value, which you could say at the end of the day is the fee that they charge for a particular service? And you and I work with refractive surgeons. I also work with aesthetic doctors. I work with cosmetic dentists, people who need to charge fees where patients pay directly for services. So your expertise is something I think they'll all benefit from.
Thank you. So it's a great question and an extremely important one for the sorts of physicians you're describing, the sorts of physicians you work with and I work with. And the reason that is when you're dealing with patient pay specialties, you as a physician, as a business person, because you're both, you have to convince a would-be patient to part with money that they literally part with. Yes, they may have Care Credit or Alpheon, but they're still going to see the full sticker price that they're paying, which is different than when you have an insurance plan that covers something and all you see is the copay. You don't know what the physician charged the insurance company. You don't really know what the discount was, what the retail price would have been. Mm-hmm. So physicians really are selling something that is not the case when you're dealing with a practice that takes a lot of insurance, which means that physicians, to maximize what they're able to charge, have to focus on the word you use, which is value, right? What is the value that I am delivering to the patient that justifies what I am charging? So, as you noted, there are many aspects to value, right? Number one, and you talk about this in your book, Beyond Bedside Manner, is patient experience. And what I mean by that is, if you are a premium surgeon delivering a premium product, and that's part of the value proposition, you have to make sure that that patient experiences that premium service from the moment they schedule their consult, to the moment they come in, to their pre-op, to their post-op. The entire relationship with your practice has to convey value, right? Because otherwise, they might as well go to someone who charges less, because why should they pay more? What are they getting for it? So one element is patient experience. Another element, of course, is the quality of the surgeon himself or herself, which is to say that obviously at the end of the day, you need to have a product that works, right? You need to deliver a solution that works for the patient and makes the patient able to justify to himself or herself why to purchase from you. And I should say that the physicians that you work with and that I work with, by virtue of the fact that they run their own practices and that they're not, for example, surgeons who are just moonlighting for chains, they have the status of being someone in that patient's life who will be there after the surgery as well. They didn't just fly in that morning and flip on the laser and do surgery and then they fly home and, well, you're out of luck, or maybe you can get a call, maybe talk to someone else if something goes wrong. These are physicians who are committed to an outcome that they stand behind, not merely with their warranties and their guarantees, though that's important, but with their reputations in the community. So again, patient experience, outcomes. Another thing that's extremely important is, and this is true in many aspects of business and in life, is what is the alternative the patient has to choosing that surgery? So you could say, well, they could choose a different surgery with a lesser surgeon, with lesser experience. And when I say lesser experience, I don't just mean the quality of the surgeon, but the quality of the patient's experience from day one till the end. And what will happen is if they choose that lesser experience, they're going to pay less, but they're also going to get less.
Mhm.
And as a physician, you absolutely should be charging what you are worth. And what you are worth is how you distinguish yourself from the competition. So as I gave you an example, right? You could choose surgery with a different surgeon. You could also say, you know what? This is too expensive for me. I'm going to stick with glasses. I'm going to stick with contact lenses. So in that case, the value proposition becomes, well, hold on a second. First of all, how well are you seeing with those contacts and with those glasses? Because if I can make you see better, there's value to having a better quality of life with better vision.
Mhm.
What are you spending each year on those glasses and on those contacts? If I can show you, and a lot of the physicians who I think do the best in terms of charging what they're worth have charts that they can show the patient. By the way, the lifetime savings you are going to get by paying for this surgery now
Mhm.
far outstrips what you'd pay over the same lifetime for the contacts and for the glasses and for the exams that come with them. So the truth is, if you think about it, you're actually saving money over the long haul by doing this surgery with me. So considering value in the context of alternatives is key because it makes the would-be patient understand that, hey, if I don't choose to do the surgery with you, okay, but I'm stuck either with the poor vision I have or the expensive non-surgical alternatives or what have you. And a lot of patients, for example, I personally still wear contact lenses, though I am planning to get LASIK later this summer. And I'm experiencing what I think the physicians call basically my contacts are ceasing to work the way they had. I'm developing an intolerance to them. And that is something that is depleting value for me. So for me, when I see the sticker price of LASIK, I have to say to myself, if I'm being reasonable and rational, well, you know what? Sure, it's expensive, but what's my alternative? Sticking with contacts that don't help me see, my eyes are dry, I don't keep them in as long anymore. I mean, that's a real diminution of value in my life. So in any event, those are the three things, right? The patient experience, the results the surgeon delivers, and the alternative to the surgery or to choosing that physician. So I think that if physicians think about their value proposition in terms of those categories, and you may have other categories in mind to ask about and we can talk about them, but those categories are key to being able to charge the price that the surgeon deserves to charge.
Well, let's add one to it. Let's add a financial one, right? The economics, because we know that it costs. There are certain costs associated with performing a procedure. There are variable costs, right? It might be a royalty fee or a consumable that is charged for every time you do a procedure, and there's a portion of fixed costs, the building, your team, the equipment potentially that have to be accounted for as well. And I'll just put a hypothesis to you because there was a surgeon who recently really opened my eyes to this, who he really believes that most LASIK surgeons are just charging too low relative to the cost to perform the procedure. And when we did the calculation, I said, by golly, he's right. It cost that surgeon upwards of $1,900. I started thinking about it with some practices I work closely with, and I was seeing costs in the $1,700 range just to perform the procedure, right? So someone who's charging $2,000 an eye, that's a very low margin, right? Over cost. What are your thoughts about this?
Right. So your point about the marginal costs and profitability is key because frankly, it permits the physician, if they are making enough money on a per surgery basis, to, if they choose, lower their volumes and still have the money coming in that they need. Right. If you were a physician who was charging $2,000 and paying out $1,900 in costs, you were only making $100 in this hypothetical, you'd have to do a lot of surgeries to make the kind of revenue that you envision for yourself. But what I also wanted to distinguish between is, and your question's a very important one, which I want to address, but let's distinguish between the value proposition from the perspective of the patient, which is once I, as the physician, decide what I'm going to charge, how do I convince the patient to pay me that amount?
Okay.
And what you're asking about now, which is equally important, which is how do I decide what to charge when I am the physician? So you're absolutely correct that at a minimum, a physician has to fully understand what his cost of goods looks like, right? His COGS. And as you noted, right, there are fixed and variable costs. If he's paying for his building, if he's paying for his staff, if he's paying for use of the equipment, if he's paying for supplies, if you don't know what your costs are, you can't possibly begin to price appropriately because, as you said, and this is typically what happens, you are likely to undercharge because you don't know how much you have to charge to make the proper margin. Now, before we talk about what margin you should set, the other thing to keep in mind, and I recommend this to all of my physicians, is figure out what other people in your market are charging. It's true that I preview of coming attractions, I am going to tell you, I want you to charge the highest amount in your local market because I believe you deserve it and because you can sell the value of that higher price.
Mm-hmm.
But you do have to have a sense of, remember I talked about alternatives, right? One set of alternatives is the patient can go to a different surgeon. So you have to have some sense of what your local market will bear in terms of pricing.
Mm-hmm.
And to give you an example, let's just say that you wanted to charge $15,000 an eye. I've never heard of that price and I don't expect it to be charged, but I'm giving it as an extreme example. If the alternatives in the local market were, $2,000 an eye at a chain and $5,000 an eye at another, surgeon's location, $15,000 becomes very hard to justify. But until you know what everybody else charges, you're really in a bad position to decide what makes sense for you to charge.
Right.
So I recommend mystery shopping the other options to every physician I help, because at a minimum, you have to know what the alternatives are from the patient's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Once you know that, again, you have to make sure that you are making enough money with each surgery that it's worth it to you to do the surgery, right? Why should you get out of bed in the morning if at the end of the day, the surgeries you're doing aren't generating any income for you? Sure, you could do it for altruistic reasons, fly to a low-income country and do them for free. That's charitable care, that's wonderful. But if you're running a business, you have to make sure that you're charging enough to more than cover your costs, right? But to have a proper return. So what I try to tell physicians is at a minimum, you need to be doubling, right? So if all of your costs were $1,900 for a given procedure, at a minimum, you should be taking in $3,800, right? So you pay, and again, what you do with that profit is up to you. You may reinvest it in certain parts of your business. You may, by the way, some physicians tell me like, I'm not doing enough marketing right now. I would love to spend more money on marketing, but I need to bring in more money first. So maybe you apportion some of that profit to marketing expenses. And oh, by the way, you then recalculate your COGS. Mm-hmm. So if your marketing expense goes up, and it's amortized over all the surgeries you do, so the COGS goes up. The cost of goods sold for each individual surgery now represents the additional money you've invested in marketing. But the point is that at a minimum, you should be doubling the difference between the cost and what you're charging. Sorry, go ahead.
And for those just tuning in or listening, this is Joe Bartel with Campion Partners. He's my guest today on PX Talk, and we're talking about how surgeons establish value for their services. Joe, it's incredible. I think a lot of doctors set their prices for refractive surgery, whether it's LASIK or refractive cataract surgery, based on being able to spread overhead across an entire practice, unless they're doing this just exclusively. And the problem they have is they undercharge. They end up not taking things into consideration they should be. And you've given them some kind of ways of countering that in terms of understanding, not only their cost of goods, but what's going on in their local market, and then going to justify a higher fee through a better level of service, and of course, a great outcome.
Correct. And what people have to remember is the way consumers, and a patient who's paying out of pocket is a consumer, the way consumers think is a lot of times a higher price conveys higher value. Think about, especially for something like your vision, right? It's one thing to say, I'm getting my wife flowers, and maybe I want to find not the most expensive florist on the block if there are other alternatives because the flowers are still nice. But do you really want to go cheap on something as important as your vision? So sometimes you signal value by charging higher prices. People are like, "Ooh, wow, that's maybe worth something because look what they're getting for that." Right. And I think what happens is a lot of physicians, it's not just that they haven't taken the time to calculate what they need to charge. I think there's an element of fear or at least trepidation that, you know what, it's going to be harder for me to close patients to convince them to purchase this surgery if I'm charging relatively higher prices, right? It's always easier to convince someone to part with less money. So what you teach, what I teach, the whole goal of this is to make the physicians realize we can train you how to close at higher prices. We can train you how to convince your patients of your value and convince them that you're worth exactly what you're charging. Don't concede in advance that you won't get the money by charging lower, because no one who sits in your office is going to hear your price and say, oh, really? Let me pay you more than your price. If you don't ask for it, you're never going to get it. You have to be what I call ambitious. That's the word I like to use, ambitious in setting your own prices, because no one's going to be ambitious for you.
Right.
And if you concede on price before you ever begin by charging too little, you can't possibly go above that price.
What you just described is the counter move, so to speak, to what consumers have been trained to do, which is to ask for a discount, right? I don't blame a consumer for coming in and asking for a discount. Of course, they'd be crazy not to ask for a discount. It's all about how the doctor and his team respond to that question. And if they're better prepared because they've really thought about it, Joe, they're going to be better off. And Joe, just summarize some of the services that you provide when you work with the practice to help them really kind of, let's say, upgrade the way they handle this whole fee, value, pricing discussion with patients.
Right. So my goal when I go into a practice is to take what the physician has, right, the people he works with and the systems that he has in place, and do the least I can do that has the most impact. And generally what that involves is, let's assume a physician has multiple, what they call closers or patient counselors or concierges. I've heard, many of those categorical names used. Let's say that they are responsible for closing the patients. So what I start by doing is by asking them, tell me honestly, because I'm here to help you. I really am. All I want you to do is I want you to succeed. I want the practice to succeed. I want the practice to bring in more money so everyone does better. Tell me what problems you have with closings. What comes up? What sort of questions do you get from patients that you have difficulty answering? Because I bet I can teach you how to handle those questions and how to steer the patient towards the outcome that will ultimately benefit the patient, but that also benefits the practice. And in the same vein, I sit with the physician, who is generally the CEO, and I say, listen, because sometimes they're not even aware of what's going on in the closing rooms, right? They're so busy, and they're so busy being good physicians that they don't fully understand the mechanism, the operational mechanism by which their own staff sells the services. So I say to the physician, what are your goals? Tell me what your goals are. How much more money do you want to make this year than last year? How did you set your price, by the way? Because I see what you're charging. How did you set that price? Maybe we need to raise it. And by the way, they all want to raise it, but they're afraid to raise it because the fear is, well, what happens if I raise it? And the answer is that if you work with me, and again, with practitioners like you as well, if you work with folks who understand how to convey value and how to teach your staff how to convey value, you're going to be able to sell at a higher price by explaining to the consumer why you're worth that higher price. So, really, the goal of every interaction I have with a practice is, how do I raise per patient revenue by I don't want you to have to take on a whole new staff. I don't care what computer system you're using. I don't care what nail polish color your receptionist is wearing. What I care about is, how do we get everybody on your team rowing in the same direction in terms of conveying value.
Yeah.
And that's the fun of this, is there is so much untapped potential in these practices if they would only realize that if they take the chance of explaining to patients why it's worth it, oftentimes the patient realizes, you know what, you're right. I didn't think of it in that way before. Now I do. I really like the way I was treated here. I feel like I can trust you. And I'm happy to pay it, because guess what? I'm getting my money's worth. So,
well, Joe, it's if I just had to summarize it for the doctor, knowledge outweighs fear. Knowledge is the way to overcome fear. And for the patient, it's about communication. Communicating effectively with the patient will overcome their doubt, their skepticism, right? Builds trust, gets them in. They win because they get the benefits of what we know is an incredible procedure, at least in refractive surgery. But it's holds true for aesthetics and cosmetic dentistry as well, and other areas where you're asking the patient to pay directly out of pocket. And the doctor wins because their revenues are going up. They have a more successful practice. They can invest more in that practice. They can invest in better training for their staff, right, for their team. And they do well, right? They do well as business owners. So it's a virtuous cycle.
It is, especially because the better they do, the more let's say they're very charitable individuals. What I tell people who like to give to charity is make more money in your business, you'll have more to give away, right? Don't say that your charitability comes in the form of, charging below what you're worth. Take what you're worth and then spend your money as you will to make things better.
Yes.
And I just think that it just requires a different way of looking at the challenge, right? I think physicians, like any business people, especially physicians, maybe because they're not trained per se as business people, and they have to remain physicians even as they run their practices. I think it's easiest sometimes to say, what's the price I can charge where I'm not going to have to fight with anybody? But if you don't think of it as a fight and rather as an educational journey, right? What can I charge if I really explain why it's worth that?
Right.
That number goes way up. And it saddens me when I see physicians not trust that they can accomplish that higher price if they would simply take the time to explain to the patients why it's worth it.
Well, Joe, this has been great. I appreciate it. And those of you listening, watching, if you want to reach Joe, it's campionpartners.com, CAMPEON partners.com, or you can reach out to me here at SM2, and we'll be glad to put you in touch with him and help you do better. Joe, thanks so much for your time today. I appreciate it, and I look forward to our next discussion together because they're always great.
Yes, thank you, Sharif. I appreciate it. And to your listeners, thank you for listening. And any questions, just reach out to Sharif or to me.